All right, we're diving into some fascinating cultural customs you might run into traveling through Asia. Our source is an article from Trafalgar, all about etiquette, traditions, things you definitely don't want to do. You know, those potential faux pas.
Exactly. And I think what makes these customs so fascinating is they really reflect deeper values like respect for elders or that whole concept of harmony.
Okay, let's start with greetings. The article mentions the way in Thailand. I've seen it, but never really understood it.
Oh, it's much more than just putting your hands together. Think of it as acknowledging someone's presence, showing respect.
Hmm.
Like a subtle language, the slight bow, how high you hold your hands, it all plays a part in their social hierarchy.
Wow, that's fascinating. Like a whole language of respect in a single gesture.
Exactly. And then you have bowing in Japan and Korea.
Ah, right.
The depth of the bow can be a casual nod or a really deep, prolonged bow. Depends on the level of formality who you're greeting.
So you got to be mindful of who you're with, what message you're sending. It's a lot of pressure.
Well, that's why it's all about awareness. Even if you don't master every little nuance, just making an effort shows respect. You're willing to learn.
Makes sense. And speaking of showing respect, taking your shoes off. The article mentions homes, temples, even some restaurants. I always wondered about that. What's the cultural significance?
It's a beautiful custom, really. It's about recognizing the sacredness of those spaces, like shedding the outside world, leaving your shoes at the door, separating the mundane from the sacred.
I love that idea, a symbolic cleansing before you enter a special place.
Exactly. And it's also about cleanliness, of course.
Yeah.
Practical considerations, too.
Right. And as long as we're talking about respect and boundaries, let's talk about Asian dining customs, specifically the do's and don'ts with your hands and feet.
Oh, yes. The article mentions touching someone's head, even a child's, is a no-no. In many cultures, the head is the most sacred part of the body.
And the opposite's true for feet. Lowest part of the body, literally and figuratively. Pointing your feet at someone? That's a big faux pas. Why is that?
It's considered so rude, almost an insult. Think back to that concept of hierarchy. Pointing your feet, especially the soles, at someone is putting them beneath you, disrespecting their position.
Makes sense. It's all about body language, how it's perceived.
Right. And speaking of body language, how about a custom that baffles most Westerners, slurping?
Okay, I'll admit I'm always self-conscious about slurping noodles in public, but the article says it's actually encouraged in some places, like Japan.
It is, and there are reasons for that. Historically, when food was scarce, slurping showed appreciation. It meant you were enjoying every bit of it.
So it's not just taste, but expressing gratitude, satisfaction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they believe it actually enhances the flavor. Slurping brings in air, cools the hot noodles down, and it distributes the flavor better.
Wow, never thought about it like that. So slurping's actually a technique.
It is. And in cultures that value the group over individual etiquette, slurping together creates this shared enjoyment, like camaraderie.
I love that. A symphony of slurps, everyone appreciating the meal together.
Exactly. And speaking of shared enjoyment, communal dining is so common in many Asian cultures. Lots of dishes on the table, everyone digging in. It's a great way to try different things and connect with everyone.
I've always loved that about Asian dining. Way more social than everyone having their separate plates. But I'm always nervous about chopsticks etiquette.
Yeah, it can be tricky, but the article points out a major no-no: sticking your chopsticks upright in a bowl of rice.
I've heard that, but why is it so bad?
Well, it looks like incense sticks used at funerals. Bad omen, you know,
Huh.
associated with death and misfortune.
Noted. Amazing how those little things can mean so much.
It really is. That's why exploring different cultures is so fascinating. It challenges us, opens our minds.
Speaking of challenging assumptions, let's talk about pouring drinks. Or not pouring your own drink, rather. The article says it's rude to pour your own drink from a shared bottle. Why is that?
It's all about hospitality, deference. Waiting for someone else to pour your drink, you're acknowledging them as the host, the server.
So it's not about being lazy, it's about respecting roles, letting others be generous.
Exactly. And if you do refill your own drink, offer to refill everyone else's first,
Yeah.
especially those older than you. It's respectful, considerate.
Like a little dance of courtesy going on around the table.
Precisely. And it shows the importance of harmony and balance, not just about you, but the whole group.
That's beautiful. And speaking of harmony and boundaries, let's talk about PDA, public displays of affection. The article mentions it's generally frowned upon between couples.
That's right, in many cultures. Open displays of affection between romantic partners, that's private. Something for behind closed doors.
But wait, the article also says holding hands with someone of the same gender is often okay. Isn't that contradictory?
You're right, and it shows how different cultures can be.
Yeah.
In some places, holding hands with a friend of the same gender is just close friendship, not romantic at all.
Interesting. So it's not about suppressing affection, it's expressing it appropriately considering the culture.
Exactly. It's a good reminder. What might seem unusual or contradictory to us could make perfect sense in another culture.
All about perspective.
Mhm.
And speaking of cultural differences, that can be confusing. Tipping. The article mentions that tipping customs are all over the place in Asia. Sometimes it's expected, sometimes offensive, sometimes somewhere in between.
Yeah, it's a minefield. And that's
Yeah.
why research beforehand is so important. Like in China and Japan, tipping is not really a thing. It can even be insulting. It's like saying you think they're not being paid fairly.
Right. But then other places like Thailand, Vietnam, it's not expected, but definitely appreciated. How do you figure that out?
When in doubt, watch the locals. Or maybe discreetly ask your guide or a local. And if you do tip, do it subtly and make sure to express your thanks.
Great advice. Be respectful and sensitive.
Exactly. And that takes us to another potential minefield: gift giving. Even with the best of intentions, it's easy to make a mistake.
Oh, yeah. I've heard the stories. Tell me more. What are some things to avoid?
For instance, in China, never give a clock as a gift. The word for clock sounds like the word for death. So it's associated with funerals, considered bad luck.
Wow. I had no idea. Amazing how the simplest thing.
I know, right? And in lots of Asian cultures, it's polite for the person to wait until you leave before opening your gift.
Why is that?
It's seen as humble. It avoids awkwardness if they don't like it, you know? Subtle but important etiquette.
Fascinating. Like a dance of politeness and respect.
Exactly. Speaking of delicate dances, ready for a potentially uncomfortable topic.
Bring it on. I'm all about trying new things, even if they're a little out of my comfort zone. What a thinking?
Squat toilets.
Yes.
Common throughout Asia, and let's be honest, they can be intimidating.
I've heard mixed reviews. Some people love them, some people dread them. What's your take?
Well, practically speaking, they can be a challenge, especially if you have mobility issues.
Hmm.
But there is some evidence that suggests they're healthier for you. Good for your bowel movements, your core muscles.
Oh, interesting. So it's a workout and a bathroom break all in one.
Exactly. Just be prepared. They often have wet floors and water hoses for cleaning instead of toilet paper.
Good to know. Okay, moving on to something more festive. New Year's celebrations. But they don't always fall on January 1st in Asia, do they?
Right. Different countries and cultures have their own traditions and dates. For example, China and Vietnam celebrate the Lunar New Year, which is usually late January or early February.
And Tyler's Songkran Water Festival in April, that's definitely on the bucket list. The whole country turns into a giant water fight. What a way to ring in the new year.
It is. People splashing each other with water, symbolizing cleansing, renewal, a fun and meaningful tradition.
Okay, we've covered a lot, from greetings to bathroom habits to New Year's. What does this all tell us about Asian cultures?
It shows the importance of context, understanding that different cultures have different ways of expressing respect, hospitality, and social harmony.
It's a good reminder to be open-minded about those differences, be willing to learn.
Exactly. And to remember that these customs often reflect deeper values and beliefs. By understanding those, we can really appreciate the richness and diversity of Asian cultures.
Absolutely. Now let's dive into some deeper cultural aspects, family values, health practices.
It's interesting, all these customs we've talked about, the greetings, the tipping, they're kind of like little glimpses into a much bigger cultural landscape.
I like that. Like we've been looking at the individual trees, but now it's time to zoom out and see the whole forest. And one of the biggest things in that forest, in Asian cultures at least, is family.
Absolutely. And our source really dives into how family structure, family values differ between, say, more traditional Asian societies and Western societies.
It's got to be a fascinating comparison. Tell me more.
Well, in many Asian cultures, family's everything. It goes beyond just the immediate family, parents and kids. It includes grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. Often the whole extended family lives together, or at least very close.
So different from the typical nuclear family we see in a lot of Western cultures.
Exactly. And this focus on extended family, it creates a strong sense of interdependence, shared responsibility, huge respect for elders. There's a source of wisdom, guidance.
I've definitely seen that in Asian movies and TV shows. Elders are revered. They're consulted on important decisions.
Right. And decisions are often made collectively, thinking about the family as a whole,
Yeah.
not just individual desires. Very different from the individualistic focus we often see in Western cultures.
So the family's like this unit facing life's challenges together, but how does this family emphasis play out in practical terms, like in healthcare?
Oh, that's a great question. And our source actually talks about that. For example, healthcare decisions, they're often made collectively, involving the whole family, not just the patient.
So it's not just the patient and the doctor making the call, the family is actively involved.
Exactly. And that can be a challenge for healthcare providers used to a more patient-centered approach.
Right.
They need to be sensitive to the family dynamics, make sure everyone's voice is heard.
It's about respecting the family, but also making sure the patient can make their own informed decisions.
Exactly. And even communication styles can be different. Direct confrontation, questioning authority, those things might be avoided. It's about preserving harmony, saving face.
Ah, that's a crucial nuance to remember. It's not about being passive, but about communicating in a way that's culturally sensitive.
You got it. Healthcare providers need to pick up on those subtle cues, be patient in explaining things, answering questions. Building trust is key.
It's fascinating how understanding these things can impact patient care so much. Now, let's shift gears a bit, explore some traditional health practices we see in Asian cultures. Our source mentions some interesting ones: coining, cupping, moxibustion,
Yeah, yeah.
acupuncture.
Yeah, they offer a really different perspective on health and healing compared to, say, the more biomedical model of Western medicine.
Okay, let's start with coining. I've heard the term, but I honestly have no idea what it is.
It sounds a little intense, I know. Basically, you rub a coin or some other smooth object on the skin, usually with oil. Creates redness, sometimes even bruising.
Wait, bruising? Doesn't that hurt?
It can be uncomfortable, but it's not supposed to be excruciating. The idea is to release negative energy, improve circulation, relieve pain.
So, kind of like a deep tissue massage, but with a coin.
Good analogy. But it's important to note, coining can leave marks. Some people might mistake them for abuse. Healthcare providers need to know about these practices so they don't misinterpret things.
Really important point. Understanding cultures can prevent those misinterpretations, make sure people get the right care. Now, what about cupping? I've seen pictures. Those circular marks look pretty intense.
They can be. Cupping involves these heated glass cups placed on the skin. The suction draws blood to the surface.
And what's the purpose of that?
It's thought to relieve muscle tension, boost circulation, even draw out toxins. It's gotten pretty popular lately, even with Western athletes and celebrities.
Wow, so ancient practices finding new fans in unexpected places.
Yeah.
How about moxibustion? What is that exactly?
So moxibustion uses dried mugwort, a type of herb. They burn it near specific points on the body, the acupuncture points.
Burning near acupuncture points. That sounds interesting. Maybe a little scary, too.
It's not as bad as it sounds. The heat from the burning mugwort is supposed to stimulate blood flow, ease pain, help the body heal. They use it for things like arthritis, back pain, digestive problems.
These traditional practices are so fascinating. They really offer a whole different perspective on health and healing.
I know, right? It just shows how important it is to be open to different approaches, when it comes to health and well-being.
Speaking of different approaches, what about the role of food in Asian cultures? Our source mentions it's not just about eating, it's tied to health beliefs.
Oh, absolutely. Many Asian cultures have specific ideas about food and how it relates to health and illness. For example, there's a big focus on balancing hot and cold properties in food.
Hold on, hot and cold foods, what does that even mean?
It's not about the temperature of the food itself, but more about its energy, its perceived qualities. Hot foods are thought to, increase body heat energy. Cold foods are thought to have cooling properties.
Okay, this is fascinating. What are some examples of hot and cold foods?
Hot foods might be things like ginger, garlic, chili peppers, maybe certain meats. Cold foods could be cucumbers, watermelon, certain types of fish.
So it's not about how hot or cold the food actually is, but about its energy, how it affects the body's balance.
Exactly. And these beliefs often influence what people eat when they're not feeling well. If someone has a cold illness, they might eat more hot foods to try and restore balance.
It's a completely different way of thinking about food's impact on health. Really shows how important it is to understand these perspectives when we give dietary advice.
Absolutely. Healthcare providers can't just dismiss these beliefs as unscientific. They need to work with patients, figure out how to integrate these practices with modern medical advice.
It's all about finding common ground, respecting those different approaches to health. Now, we can't talk about health without mentioning the spiritual side, which is so important in many Asian cultures.
You're so right. Our source lists the most common faiths in Asia: Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, Shamanism, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, and Sikhism, each with its own beliefs that can impact healthcare.
Wow, that's a lot. Must be tricky for healthcare providers to navigate that.
It takes sensitivity, willingness to learn. You got to approach each patient with respect for their beliefs, even if they're different from yours. Can't assume everyone has the same ideas about illness, treatment, even death.
So how can healthcare providers have these conversations respectfully and effectively?
Starts with asking open-ended questions, really listening to the patient. Like, what are your beliefs about this illness? Or are there any spiritual practices that are important to you?
So acknowledging that spiritual side and finding ways to include their beliefs in their care.
Exactly. For example, if a patient has certain dietary rules because of their religion, the provider needs to know about that, make adjustments.
Or if they want to involve a spiritual leader, the provider should be open to that.
Exactly. It's all about making the patient feel heard, understood, supported in their beliefs.
And that brings us to a topic that's often not talked about enough: mental health. How do Asian cultures view mental illness?
It's complex, and it varies across cultures. But one common thing is that mental illness is often stigmatized. It's not something people talk about openly. There's this cultural focus on keeping your emotions in check, being stoic, which can make it hard to express distress.
And there's that fear of bringing shame to the family, right?
Yeah, exactly. Mental illness can be seen as a weakness, like the family has failed in some way.
Yeah.
This can keep people from getting help, from talking about their struggles.
So how do we break down these barriers, encourage people to get the support they need?
It's going to take a lot of different efforts. Education, awareness campaigns can help to break down myths about mental illness. We need mental health services that are culturally sensitive, easy to access, and affordable.
And it's important to involve the family, especially if they play a big role in the patient's life.
Absolutely. We need to build a supportive environment where people feel safe talking about their mental health without being judged or shamed.
It's about creating empathy and understanding. Now, let's talk about some specific health risks faced by Asian populations. Our source highlights a few key areas, starting with diabetes.
Yeah, diabetes is a big concern, higher rates in some Asian groups. It's probably a combination of genes and lifestyle, especially with people moving to Western countries, diets changing.
So it's not just about genetics, but about how environment and culture affect health.
Right. We need prevention and management programs that are tailored to those cultures.
What about other health concerns specific to Asian populations?
Our source mentions low cervical screening rates among some groups. Could be cultural modesty, lack of awareness, language barriers. We got to overcome those barriers, make screening easier and culturally appropriate.
And then there's cardiovascular disease, a major issue for a lot of Asian populations.
Yeah, some Asian populations have higher rates of high blood pressure, cholesterol, which can lead to heart problems. And of course, lifestyle factors like diet and smoking play a role too.
So it's about healthy lifestyles, managing those risk factors, and getting quality cardiac care.
For sure. Our source also talks about avoidable hospitalizations. Some Asian groups end up in the hospital more often than they need to. Could be delays in seeking care, language barriers, cultural differences in how people approach healthcare.
So important to address those barriers, make sure everyone gets the care they need when they need it in a way that respects their culture. What else is there?
The source mentions family violence and also higher rates of some surgical procedures like hysterectomies and knee replacements in certain Asian groups.
These are complex issues. We need to tackle the social and cultural factors, make sure support services are available, provide culturally sensitive care. It's about empowering people to take charge of their health.
Exactly. And it just shows how much more research we need to do to understand why these differences exist so we can find solutions.
It's amazing all these connections between culture, lifestyle, and health. Shows why we need a holistic approach to healthcare.
Totally agree. And we need to remember that each person's health is shaped by their own background, their culture, their experiences in life.
It's amazing how much we can learn by looking closely at these cultural differences, especially in healthcare. It's not just about the physical part, but understanding the whole person, their background, their beliefs, what they've been through.
Absolutely. And that leads us to a group that often faces unique challenges as Asian youth, especially those adjusting to a Western environment.
Right. Our source touches on that, the pressures, the adjustments. It must be tough navigating two different cultures like that.
It's a balancing act, trying to meet the expectations of your family, your heritage, while also adapting to a whole new culture. It's culture shock, different social rules, sometimes even feeling out of place. Plus, there's often a huge emphasis on doing well in school, high expectations from family back home.
I can only imagine how stressful that would be, trying to live up to two different, sometimes conflicting sets of expectations.
Exactly. And it's common for young people to have conflicts with their families as they become more westernized, so to speak. Values change, perspectives shift, it creates tension, that classic generation gap, but with cultural differences layered on top.
It shows that cultural transitions aren't always easy. There can be real struggles involved.
Absolutely. And all of this can really affect their mental and emotional health. It's so important to provide support and understanding. They're at a vulnerable stage in their lives.
So what can we do? How can we support Asian youth going through these transitions?
We need to give them spaces where they feel safe, to talk about their struggles, figure out who they are, where they belong, mentorship programs, cultural exchange groups, even just having honest conversations can be huge.
It's about creating community, letting them know they're not alone.
Exactly. And we can't forget about those potential health risks that can come with these lifestyle changes either.
Yeah, the article mentioned that. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, some Asian youth, as they adapt to Western culture, might pick up some less healthy habits, eating more processed food, less physical activity, maybe even trying things like smoking or drinking. Those cultural shifts can have both good and bad sides.
Like a trade-off. New experiences, opportunities, but maybe losing some of the healthy aspects of their traditional culture.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance, promoting healthy choices while also respecting their choices.
Empowering them to make good decisions about their health and well-being.
That's it. And that brings us back to the main point of this whole deep dive cultural understanding.
So we've covered a lot. Greetings, table manners, family values, traditional healing, the challenges Asian youth face. What are the key takeaways for our listeners? What do you hope they'll remember?
Well, the biggest takeaway, I think, is that Asia is not just one big homogenous thing. It's a continent full of so many different cultures. What might seem weird or different to us is simply a reflection of different ways of seeing the world, different values and beliefs.
It reminds us to approach these differences with an open mind. Be curious, respectful, ready to learn, ask questions, listen, and check our own assumptions.
Yeah. And remembering that understanding these things can help us in all sorts of ways. Whether we're traveling, working with people from different backgrounds, or taking care of patients, it enriches our lives, broadens our horizons.
We've barely scratched the surface here, but hopefully you're feeling a little more knowledgeable and maybe even a little more fascinated by the richness of Asian cultures.
And remember, there's even more variation within each country and culture. It's a lifelong journey of learning and exploring.
So true. Now, here's something for you to think about. Which of these cultural customs really stood out to you? And why? We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Absolutely. Keep the conversation going. Share your insights, because there's always more to discover and learn.